The desert sun was merciless, scorching the cracked earth and making the air ripple with unbearable heat. In the middle of that vast, unforgiving landscape stood a motionless figure, a thoroughbred horse, or what was left of one. Its once proud body was now nothing but skin and bones, covered in a writhing mass of flies that clung to its open wounds. The horse's dull, lifeless eyes barely blinked. It was on the brink of death, abandoned to its fate, and no one dared to come near. Drivers passing by on the nearby dirt road stole quick glances but kept moving. Locals whispered that the animal was beyond saving. Some took pictures, horrified by the sight, but no one stopped. The stench of sweat, dry blood, and slow decay filled the air, a cruel reminder that time was running out for everyone who saw it. The thoroughbred was already dead. It was just a matter of time. But then, one man stopped his truck. Michael Turner, a retired horse breeder, pulled over and sat in silence, staring at the dying animal. He had spent years rescuing horses, but, after losing his own beloved stallion to a devastating illness, had sworn never to go through that pain again. He had convinced himself that he was done saving lost causes. Yet, as he looked into the horse's weary eyes, something stirred inside him, a voice that told him some lives are still worth fighting for. He stepped out of his truck, the brim of his hat shielding his face from the relentless sun. The horse barely reacted. Moving slowly, Michael uncapped a water bottle and let a few drops spill onto the dry earth, hoping for a response. At first, nothing happened. Then, weak and hesitant, the horse's parched lips twitched, reaching for the water. That was all Michael needed to see. He couldn't walk away, not this time. Michael fashioned a makeshift lead rope and gently tried to coax the horse forward, but the poor creature was too weak. Its legs trembled violently, threatening to give out beneath it. The desert was unforgiving, ready to claim another life. Then Michael's heart clenched as he looked toward the horizon. A sandstorm was coming. If they stayed there, the horse wouldn't last another hour. With no other choice, Michael threw a tarp over the animal and braced himself against the wind. The storm raged through the night, the world reduced to a suffocating blur of sand and howling winds. And through it all, Michael held on, refusing to let death take this horse without a fight. By dawn, the storm had passed, and against all odds, the thoroughbred was still alive. Michael managed to load the weak animal onto his truck and drive him back to his ranch. What he didn't know was that this rescue was only the beginning. Days later, while cleaning the horse's wounds, Michael's fingers brushed against something that made his blood run cold, a brand he recognized instantly. His heart pounded as the realization hit him. This wasn't just any horse, this was Shadow Dancer, one of the most valuable thoroughbreds in the country, and his disappearance had not been an accident. Michael drove down the dirt road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The old truck rattled with every bump, the worn-out suspension barely holding up under the weight of its unexpected passenger. In the rearview mirror, he could see the thoroughbred swaying slightly, his thin legs struggling to stay steady. Every so often, the horse let out a labored breath, his body heaving under the strain of simply staying alive. Michael had rescued plenty of animals in his lifetime, but none had ever looked this close to death. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The scorching sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. Michael knew the real challenge was just beginning. This horse wasn't just malnourished, he was on the verge of collapse. If he didn't act fast, the rescue would have been for nothing. As he pulled up to his ranch, he wasted no time. He opened the trailer gate, but the thoroughbred didn't move. His legs trembled, barely able to hold his own weight. Michael cursed, under his breath. He knew the horse was too weak to step down on his own. Moving quickly, He grabbed a bucket of water and splashed some on the horse's muzzle. The reaction was instant. The animal flinched, then flicked his dry tongue out, desperate for more. Michael's heart ached at the sight. This wasn't just dehydration. This was starvation, abuse, neglect. Someone had left this horse out there to die. He had seen it before, racing horses pushed past their limits, then discarded when they were no longer profitable. But something about this one was different. The brand he had found earlier still burned in his mind. Shadow Dancer. He knew that name. Everyone in the horse racing world did. For now, the mystery of how this horse ended up in the middle of nowhere would have to wait. Michael had more pressing concerns. He grabbed a handful of hay and slowly offered it, watching as the thoroughbred hesitated before taking a bite. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The real fight was only beginning. The horse needed medical attention, strength, and time to recover. But deep down, Michael knew one thing for sure. Whoever had abandoned Shadow Dancer had made a mistake, because now this horse had someone willing to fight for him. The night stretched on, heavy with silence, broken only by the faint rustling of straw and the weak breaths of the thoroughbred lying in the dimly lit stall. Michael sat on an overturned feed bucket just outside the enclosure, his elbows resting on his knees, exhaustion weighing him down like a lead blanket. He had seen injured horses before, some battered by years of racing, others discarded when they were no longer profitable. But this was something else. Whoever had left Shadow Dancer out there in the desert had done so with a purpose. They hadn't expected him to be found. Michael's calloused fingers traced the rim of a dented coffee mug, his mind replaying the moment he had found the brand. The mark had been faint, nearly hidden beneath layers of grime and dried blood, but unmistakable once revealed. Shadow Dancer. He had heard the name before. Everyone in the horse racing world had. The stallion had been a rising star, a horse with fire in his veins, a multi-million-dollar investment for his powerful owner. But then he had vanished. The sharp sound of tires crunching against gravel snapped Michael out of his thoughts. Dr. Evelyn Carter had arrived. The veterinarian stepped out of her truck, her long auburn hair pulled into a loose braid, her expression grim as she grabbed her medical kit. She had seen countless neglected animals over the years, but as soon as her eyes fell on Shadow Dancer's frail body, she stopped cold. "Jesus, Michael," she murmured, kneeling beside the horse. She ran practiced hands over his skeletal frame, her fingertips grazing over the deep ridges of his ribs. His skin twitched slightly. A faint response, but otherwise he didn't move. Evelyn let out a slow, controlled breath. Malnourished, severely dehydrated, open wounds. He shouldn't be alive. Michael's jaw tightened. "But he is." Evelyn glanced up at him. "Not for long if we don't act fast." She reached into her kit, pulling out an IV bag. "We need to get fluids into him immediately. He's barely holding on." Michael watched as she worked, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the air as she cleaned the worst of the wounds. Shadow Dancer flinched when the needle pricked his skin, a sign of life, a sign that there was still fight left in him. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This horse wasn't ready to give up, but there was something else. Something neither of them had said yet. Shadow Dancer had disappeared months ago. If he had been stolen, then abandoned, someone had wanted him gone, and if they found out he was still alive, they'd come looking for him. The sun had barely risen over the ranch, casting long golden shadows across the fields, but Michael had been awake for hours. Sleep didn't come easy when too many unanswered questions gnawed at his mind. Shadow Dancer had survived the night, but his fight was far from over. The IV bag now hung from a hook inside the stall, a slow drip feeding life back into the thoroughbred's frail body. Michael watched as the horse stirred slightly, his breathing no longer as shallow as before. He was holding on, But for how long? Evelyn had stayed the night, checking on the horse every few hours. Now she stood at the stall door, her arms crossed, exhaustion evident in her sharp green eyes. "You know we need to report this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Shadow Dancer didn't just run off. Someone dumped him there to die. The authorities need to know." Michael sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew she was right. If Shadow Dancer's disappearance had been an accident, his owner, Randall Kingston, would have had search teams combing the state. Instead, the horse had been left to rot in the desert like an inconvenient problem that needed to disappear. "Yeah," he muttered, glancing at the stall. "But if we make a call now, we could be putting a target on his back. If someone wanted him dead, they wouldn't stop just because we found him." Evelyn didn't argue. She knew as well as he did that horse racing was a ruthless business. Greed ran deeper than blood in that world, and horses, no matter how valuable, were just commodities. Once they lost their worth, they became liabilities, and Michael had a sickening feeling that Shadow Dancer had been one of those liabilities. Turning back toward the stall, Michael stepped inside, carefully crouching next to the weakened horse. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice softer than usual. The horse's ear twitched, a small acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We're going to figure this out." He reached out and ran a hand gently over the thoroughbred's neck, feeling the subtle tremors still running through him. Then something caught his eye. A faint scar just above the brand mark. A surgical incision, long healed but still visible beneath the dirt. His gut clenched. He had seen something like this before years ago when he had worked with retired racehorses. It wasn't a normal injury. It was the kind of scar left behind after a procedure meant to cover something up. Michael looked up at Evelyn, his expression dark. "Something's not right," he said. "This horse didn't just get abandoned. Somebody was hiding something." The early morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and hay, but Michael barely noticed. His mind was racing, replaying every detail since he had found Shadow Dancer in the desert. The scar above the brand, nearly invisible beneath layers of dirt and sweat, had unsettled him in a way nothing else had. This wasn't just a case of neglect. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide something. Evelyn knelt beside the thoroughbred, running her fingers gently over the faded scar. "This wasn't an accident," she murmured, her voice laced with concern. "This kind of incision, it looks surgical. But why?" Her brow furrowed as she stood crossing her arms. "Racehorses get injuries all the time, but procedures like this, they usually mean someone was trying to cover something up." Michael's stomach twisted. He had spent decades around racehorses, seen the best and the worst of the industry. He had witnessed animals pushed beyond their limits, their bodies treated like machines until they broke. And when they did, they were either quietly retired or discarded. He looked at Shadow Dancer, at his frail but determined body, and felt a surge of anger. Somebody had thrown this horse away, but why? Grabbing his phone, Michael scrolled through old racing records, his fingers moving faster as his suspicion grew. Shadow Dancer had been a rising star, a stallion with an undefeated streak. But then, 6 months ago, he had vanished. The official story was theft, but no ransom was ever demanded. No real efforts were made to find him. It was as if Kingston had simply let him go, and that didn't make sense. Evelyn peered over his shoulder, reading the records along with him. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of Shadow Dancer's medical history. 2 weeks before he disappeared, he was pulled from a race. The reason given was a minor injury, but there's nothing here about what that injury was. She glanced at Michael. "That's not normal." Michael's jaw tightened. No owner would pull a $1 million horse from a race without a damn good reason, unless that minor injury wasn't so minor. Unless Shadow Dancer had sustained something career-ending, something Kingston didn't want the world to know. His pulse quickened as the pieces started falling into place. He turned to Evelyn, his voice low and steady. Shadow Dancer wasn't stolen. He swallowed hard, realization sinking in. Kingston got rid of him. He knew this horse was no longer profitable, so he made sure he disappeared. Michael looked back at the stall, watching as the thoroughbred slowly shifted his weight, fighting to stay on his feet. But he hadn't died. He had survived. And now someone was going to have to answer for what they did to him. The weight of the truth settled heavily on Michael's chest as he paced the length of the barn. Shadow Dancer's presence here wasn't just a mistake. It was a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. Randall Kingston had made sure the world believed the thoroughbred had been stolen, but in reality, he had been discarded like worthless stock. Michael clenched his fists. That bastard had tried to erase this horse's existence. Evelyn sat on a hay bale, her fingers idly tapping against her knee, deep in thought. If Kingston wanted him gone, he's not going to be happy knowing he's still alive, she said, voicing the thought that had been gnawing at both of them. And if we start asking questions, it won't take long before someone figures out where he is. She looked at Michael seriously. We need to be careful. Michael exhaled slowly. She was right. Kingston was a powerful man with deep pockets and even deeper connections. If he got wind that Shadow Dancer had survived, he wouldn't hesitate to send someone to fix the problem. Michael had no doubt that men like him had ways of making things disappear for good. The thought made his blood run cold. Turning back toward the stall, Michael studied the horse carefully. Shadow Dancer was improving, but he was still far from strong. His coat had regained some of its luster, and his eyes, once lifeless, now held a flicker of awareness. But he wasn't ready to run, not yet. And if Kingston came looking, he wouldn't stand a chance. Michael ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing through the possibilities. They could report this, get law enforcement involved. But he knew Kingston's reach extended far beyond the track. Money talked. And in the world of high-stakes racing, the truth was often buried beneath a pile of cash. No, if they wanted to keep Shadow Dancer safe, they couldn't just sit back and hope for justice. They had to be one step ahead. Evelyn's voice broke through his thoughts. I know someone who might be able to help, she hesitated. A journalist. She's been digging into corruption in horse racing for years. Illegal drugging, race-fixing, horse disappearances. If we give her this story, it might be enough to take Kingston down. Michael stared at her for a long moment. It was risky, going public with this meant putting a target on their backs, not just Shadow Dancers, but theirs as well. But as he looked at the thoroughbred, at the fighter who had defied death itself, he knew there was no other choice. Kingston had tried to erase this horse from existence. Now, Michael was going to make sure the whole damn world knew the truth. The decision had been made, but the weight of it pressed heavily on Michael's chest. He had spent years keeping his head down, staying out of trouble. He wasn't the type to go looking for a fight. But this was different. Shadow Dancer had fought to survive, and now it was Michael's turn to fight for him. Randall Kingston had gotten away with too much for too long. Evelyn wasted no time. She pulled out her phone and stepped outside to make the call, leaving Michael alone with the thoroughbred. The horse was standing now, a little stronger than the night before, his ears flicking at the distant sounds of the ranch waking up. Every so often, he let out a labored breath, his body heaving under the strain of simply staying alive. Michael had rescued plenty of animals in his lifetime, but none had ever looked this close to death. The drive back to the ranch had felt longer than usual. The scorching sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. Michael knew the real challenge was just beginning. This horse wasn't just malnourished, he was on the verge of collapse. If he didn't act fast, the rescue would have been for nothing. As he pulled up to his ranch, he wasted no time. He opened the trailer gate, but the thoroughbred didn't move. His legs trembled, barely able to hold his own weight. Michael cursed, under his breath. He knew the horse was too weak to step down on his own. Moving quickly, he grabbed a bucket of water and splashed some on the horse's muzzle. The reaction was instant. The animal flinched, then flicked his dry tongue out, desperate for more. Michael's heart ached at the sight. This wasn't just dehydration. This was starvation, abuse, neglect. Someone had left this horse out there to die. He had seen it before, racing horses pushed past their limits, then discarded when they were no longer profitable. But something about this one was different. The brand he had found earlier still burned in his mind. Shadow Dancer. He knew that name. Everyone in the horse racing world did. For now, the mystery of how this horse ended up in the middle of nowhere would have to wait. Michael had more pressing concerns. He grabbed a handful of hay and slowly offered it, watching, as the thoroughbred hesitated before taking a bite. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The real fight was only beginning. The horse needed medical attention, strength, and time to recover. But deep down, Michael knew one thing for sure. Whoever had abandoned Shadow Dancer had made a mistake, because now this horse had someone willing to fight for him. A few minutes later, Evelyn returned, her face unreadable. "She's in," she said. "Her name is Lauren Tate, investigative journalist. She's been trying to expose Kingston for years, but never had enough to pin anything solid on him." She hesitated. "Until now." Michael crossed his arms, studying her. "And you trust her?" Evelyn nodded. "If there's anyone who's not afraid to go, after Kingston, it's her. She's been threatened, sued, blacklisted, but she hasn't backed down. If we give her this, she won't just report it. She'll burn his empire to the ground." Michael let out a slow breath. This was bigger than just rescuing a horse. Now, this was about justice, about making sure Kingston never did this to another animal again. But before they could take their next step, something caught Michael's eye, a dust cloud forming on the horizon. The unmistakable outline of a black SUV speeding down the dirt road toward the ranch. His gut twisted. Someone was coming, and they sure as hell weren't here for a friendly visit. He turned to Evelyn, his voice calm but firm. "Get Shadow Dancer out of sight, now." The black SUV barreled down the dirt road, kicking up a thick cloud of dust as it approached. Michael's stomach tightened. Whoever was inside wasn't here by accident. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She grabbed Shadow, Dancer's lead rope, and quickly guided him toward the back of the barn, where an old storage area was lined with hay bales. The horse, still weak but sensing the tension, followed her without resistance. Michael took a steadying breath and stepped outside, squaring his shoulders just as the SUV rolled to a stop. The engine cut off, and for a brief moment, there was only silence. Then the doors swung open, and two men in dark suits stepped out. They looked out of place against the dusty backdrop of the ranch, their polished shoes already gathering dirt. The taller of the two, a man with slicked-back hair and cold, assessing eyes, adjusted his tie before turning his attention to Michael. "Michael Turner?" the man asked, his voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. Michael didn't answer right away, simply staring him down, his expression unreadable. "Depends on who's asking," Michael said finally, his tone even. He wasn't about to be intimidated on his own land. The man offered a practiced smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "No need for hostility. I'm just here on behalf of a concerned party." He gestured toward the barn. "I heard you recently took in a horse, one that, let's say, isn't exactly yours to keep." Michael's jaw tightened. "I take in a lot of horses. You'll have to be more specific." The man's smile faded, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Let's not play games, Mr. Turner. My employer would prefer to resolve this matter quietly. If you Hand over the horse now. We can all walk away without any problems. His gaze darkened. But if you make this difficult, well, let's just say things have a way of getting complicated. Michael held the man's stare, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He knew their type, men who were used to getting what they wanted, one way or another. But if they thought he would just hand over Shadow Dancer without a fight, they had severely underestimated him. He took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto the man's. "I think you should leave," Michael said, his voice low and firm. "Before things get complicated for you." Michael didn't move, didn't blink. The two men in suits stood before him like vultures, their polished shoes sinking slightly into the dust-covered ground. The lead man, the one with slicked-back hair and an unsettling calmness, tilted his head slightly as if assessing just how difficult this was going to be. His partner, broader and quieter, shifted his weight, one hand casually resting near the inside of his jacket, a silent warning. Michael had seen enough threats in his life to recognize one when it was standing, right in front of him. But what these men didn't know, what Kingston didn't know, was that Michael Turner wasn't the type to back down. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the lead man said, his voice smooth as glass but sharp enough to cut. "We're not here to cause trouble, Mr. Turner. We just want what belongs to Mr. Kingston. If you cooperate, this ends today." His gaze flickered toward the barn as if he could see straight through the wooden walls to where Shadow Dancer was hidden. Michael stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "That horse doesn't belong to Kingston anymore," he said, his voice steady. "Far as I see it, he threw him away. And I don't take kindly to men who throw away good horses." The man let out a slow breath, shaking his head as if disappointed. "You're making a mistake." Michael didn't even hesitate. "No, you are." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The second man, the one with his hand near his jacket, tensed slightly. Michael's muscles coiled, ready, but then the lead man smirked. Not out of amusement, but as if he had just decided something important, something dangerous. "Well," he said, turning toward the SUV, "I hope you're ready to deal with the consequences." His partner shot Michael, one last look before following him. A moment later, the engine roared to life, kicking up a thick cloud of dust as they sped off down the road. Michael didn't relax, not even after they disappeared over the horizon. He knew the truth deep in his bones. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And the next time they came back, they wouldn't be asking nicely. The dust from the black SUV had barely settled when Michael turned on his heel and strode toward the barn. His pulse was steady, but his mind raced. They would be back, and next time there would be no conversation, just action. He had seen men like them before, men who never asked twice, men who believed money and power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. But this time, they had made a mistake. They had come for something Michael wasn't willing to give up. Inside the barn, Shadow Dancer stood quietly in the dim light, his ears flicking as he sensed Michael's tension. The horse looked stronger now, his coat beginning to regain some of its sheen, his frame still thin but no longer fragile. He was recovering, but would he be ready for what was coming? Michael reached out and ran a hand along the horse's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his fingertips. "We're not done fighting yet, boy," he murmured. Evelyn reappeared from the storage area, wiping her hands on her jeans. "We can't wait for them to come back," she said, her voice low but firm. "We need to move him tonight." Michael exhaled slowly. She was right. Keeping Shadow Dancer here was no longer an option. Kingston had found them too easily, which meant someone had tipped him off, someone had been watching. If they wanted to keep the horse safe, they had to disappear before Kingston's men returned, and they had to make sure no one followed. "I'll call Lauren Tate," Evelyn continued. "She has contacts. There are rescue ranches out of state, places that take in horses like him where no one will ever find him." She hesitated. But once he's gone, you'll never see him again. Michael clenched his jaw, staring at the thoroughbred in front of him. He had spent weeks nursing this horse back from the edge of death, fighting against everything in him to avoid getting attached. But it was too late. He was attached, damn it. He cared. Still, he knew what had to be done. He gave Shadow Dancer one last firm stroke along his neck before stepping back. "Do it," he said. "Make the call." Hours later, under the cover of darkness, a truck and trailer pulled up to the barn. Shadow Dancer hesitated as Michael led him up the ramp, his dark eyes watching him carefully. Michael swallowed hard and gave the horse a final pat. "Go on now," he whispered. "You're free." As the door shut and the trailer disappeared into the night, Michael stood in the silence, hands on his hips, staring at the empty space where Shadow Dancer had been. Kingston had lost. The horse had won. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt at peace.